Hi, I'm Steve Adelman. Welcome to Adelman on Venues. This month I'm going to upend your expectations of what Adelman on Venues is by doing this video version. So what I'm going to talk about today is crowd management and the subject of expectations. And what I've done is prepare a short, video version. And let's look at some pictures. So what we're going to talk about here is the evolution of crowd management. And it's not a terribly long evolution. It starts back in the late 1960s and early 70s with a New York City traffic engineer named John Fruin. And John Fruin, after observing the way vehicles move on roads, realized that people move in similar ways. The dynamics, as he referred to it, are similar. And he came up with 4 crowd dynamics factors: time, space, information, and energy. And so John Fruin looked at the way crowds behave through the prism of those 4 factors. And if you work through those factors yourself, you'll find that in fact events and crowd behavior do change based on how early before an event is it, or is it showtime? How much space do you have? Because a crowd can behave much differently if they are tightly packed than if they are loosely spaced. Is there wayfinding? Is there information that's given either verbally or through video messaging that can help to move a crowd or calm them or excite them? And what actually is the energy of the crowd, which will determine in some significant part how likely they are to even hear a message, much less to understand it and do something about it. So dating back to the early 1970s through his influential book, Pedestrian Planning and Design, John Fruin's 4 crowd management factors have been really the industry standard, at least a foundational industry standard for coming up with a crowd management plan. And we know that because his 4 factors, time, space, information, and energy, have been codified in the National Fire Protection Association's Life Safety Code, which is sort of the Bible for crowd management, at least in the United States. And as you can see from this short excerpt, crowd management training pursuant to NFPA should include a clear appreciation of crowd dynamics factors, and here are Fruin's 4 factors, including space, energy, time, and information. So dating back to the beginning of the 70s, those have been the 4 factors that people should pay attention to when determining how to manage a crowd. More recently, starting around 2000 and then moving closer to the present, an Englishman named Keith Still came up with a variation on how to manage a crowd, and he started to characterize the crowd dynamics factors as shown on this screen. He divided them into the influences on crowd behavior and then the phases of behavior based on the time of the event. Importantly for this talk that I'm doing right now, Keith Still focused on 3 influences on crowd behavior: the design of the event, the design of the physical space, all of the things that determine how people will exist within the space that they're in, whether that space is a green field festival, an indoor arena, a nightclub, performing arts center, convention center. It could be a playground separated by ropes or chain link fence. The design of the space, that was the first factor that Keith Still looked at as an influence on crowd behavior. Second, the information provided to that crowd so they understand what they should do, what's expected of them, what they can do if they need to move in a way that they weren't expecting to. So all of the messaging that ought to exist, that should be planned out in advance, Keith Still realized that those are important influences on crowd behavior, which is why people who do crowd management spend so much time talking about messaging. The third influence on crowd behavior is management, and that can include everything from signage, guest services staff, the people holding signs that say, "Ask me," security, off-duty law enforcement, whoever is keeping the peace. Management can include medical professionals if there are substances that are reasonably likely to impair people or jeopardize their health. Managing that aspect of the crowd's health and safety is also part of crowd behavior. And so Keith still focused on design, information, and management of an event during the times of ingress, starting from when people queue up to getting into whatever the venue happens to be, circulation, when they're experiencing the event itself, whether they're moving or stationary, they are inside of the venue space, and then egress, obviously, when they're leaving. And so Keith still formulating crowd management from this perspective. The acronym is DIM-ICE, Design, Information, Management during Ingress, Circulation, and Egress. And all of this makes good sense to me, and I've worked through the DIM-ICE model, but it always struck me that something was missing, and I could never articulate it. And then I had a conversation with my friend Tim Roberts, who is director of the Event Safety Shop. And Tim and I were talking a couple of weeks ago, and he made a comment, almost a throwaway line. And he said, I think that there is an influence on crowd behavior that's missing from the DIM-ICE model. And here's what he said: the crowd's expectations are missing. And the light bulb went off for me. The crowd's expectations are really important because we know from looking at human psychology and also historical events that what people expect has an enormous influence on what they perceive and on how they react to what they perceive. So first, after dropping this line that the DIM-ICE model is missing the crowd's expectations, Tim sent me some literature, and he sent me some articles, and well, sure enough, they focus on human psychology and the way our brains perceive our circumstances. And lo and behold, we perceive what we expect to see, much less than what actually is. And so our ability to react, to respond decisively to information, is very much colored by our expectations of what information we'll receive. And as I was reading through articles, including these that Tim Roberts had sent, I realized I've already done this work. I've studied this too, going back to the NFPA Life Safety Code. And so now this is the same slide that I showed you a couple of minutes ago, but look at the blue text at the bottom. Not only does the code want us to focus on Fruin's 4 factors of time, space, information, and energy, but also the code says training should include the expected types of human behavior. Human behavior, the psychology of crowds is an essential part of what someone needs to understand in order to manage those crowds. And then I realized further, yeah, I've written about this myself in the context of active shooter situations, why people don't decisively respond to the sound of gunfire by either running or hiding or fighting. Lo and behold, it's because they don't expect that. There's a psychological term for what's going on here. It's confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the phenomenon that we all have, which is the world as it has been every day up until today is what we expect today will be like also. And so when we hear, see, feel things that are not conforming to our own life experience, we tend to either reject it completely or we reshape that input into some form that makes more sense to us. And so there is a significant historical record of that. And so now I'm going to show you some books because I've studied this stuff and I didn't even realize until the word expectations was told to me. But this is about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911. why did people not use the brand new device of the telephone? Because they were used to using something else. And so they couldn't believe that the circumstances required them to act more quickly. And so basically they used the ancient equivalent of a fax machine, which was incredibly unreliable, rather than just picking up the phone. 1911. This is about a circus tent fire in Hartford, Connecticut in 1944. Again, people didn't expect that the tent that they were sitting under would be aflame. And so what did they do when they perceived flames? Nothing. They sat there and they waited for someone else to handle it, because that's what people do. We can't believe that situations are different. But that's not all. This is about the 1977 Beverly Hills Supper Club fire just outside of Cincinnati. And again, people could not believe that there would be a fire in essentially a giant wedding hall. And so the guests simply sat there and, in fact, ordered drinks and continued to listen to the comics on stage. Meanwhile, the building was burning around them. Smoke was puffing in through the doorways. Guests sat. It's confirmation bias. It's not that people are stupid. It's that we can't believe things that are, well, unbelievable. There's more. My bookcase is full of this stuff. This is Killer Show, a fabulous book about the 2003 Station nightclub fire in West Warwick, Rhode Island. And again, people simply did not move. They expected there to be pyro at a great white show, and there was pyro. And so when the pyro lit the ceiling on fire, people didn't realize that wasn't part of the show. And so it took some other sensory input, in this case, billowing smoke and then the smoke alarm going off, until people started to move. And by then, well, it was too late for a lot of people. So the crowd's expectations matter a lot. And so when it occurred to me, yeah, I've actually done this research myself, then I realized the model that Keith Still had given us was not quite complete. And so here's my revision. The revised way to plan for crowds is to look at 4 influences on crowd behavior. The previous 3, design, information, and management of crowds, and the 4th one, the crowd's expectations, because their expectations will hold them back. It will keep them from seeing clearly what there is right in front of them if they were rational. But we're not. We're emotional, and our brains take over and fill in gaps even when we don't even realize that there are gaps. I'm no psychologist, but I can read, and you can too. And you will find that confirmation bias is a real thing. And you will learn, if you do the research, that everyone's brain has something called a reticular activating system, basically a giant filter that takes all the noise that we experience every day, the 2 million plus bits of information, and filters out most of it so that we can function. Unfortunately, it's not a very accurate filter. And so we tend to filter out things that we don't expect because we think that we don't want that information. The expectations of a crowd matter a great deal. And I'll give you a last example, which I know for some of you I have done live, and for many of you I've put on PowerPoint slides, but here it is. This is the famous mug that I have shown many times before. And the reason I showed this mug is to show the phenomenon of confirmation bias. But really, it's an expectation issue. So remember, this is something that I won in the national trial competition in law school a long time ago. And there was a table set up with a stack of these. And it was fabulous. And law students were grabbing them off the table. And there was somebody from the administration of the national trial competition smiling and looking at all of us grabbing these mugs. And everyone looked at them and said, yeah, that's okay. It's not. Read it. That's why I'm holding it here. we see what we expect to see. We hear what we expect to hear. Our senses betray us. And so it becomes that much more important when coming up with a crowd management plan to include, to factor in that reactions will be slow. Perception will be uncertain. And so the messaging that we give, the belt and suspenders approach of using multiple different formats, lots of different people, whether they're guest services or security or video messages or oral announcements, all of those things are necessary because people won't get the message the first time. They won't act decisively because they don't have great situational awareness, particularly in unfamiliar spaces that are dark, loud, crowded, unfamiliar, where there may be a beverage or substance or two. People stay together, and so they're reluctant to just leave. These are all recognized phenomena. The crowd's expectations are essential factors to consider when coming up with a crowd management plan. And so, although I have violated your expectations in this instance by doing this video, I hope that it has been worth your time. Thank you very much. I'm Steve Adelman.